You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property and their laws. They had no part in making it.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 244 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Joining me on today's show is the most frequent guest I have to the show. I call him the unofficial co-host at times, Will Porter. Will is a freelance journalist who specializes in Middle East affairs and U.S. foreign policy. His work can be found at antiwar.com, consortiumnews.com, and libertarianinstitute.org, which just happens to be the best place to find this podcast as well, and the show notes page, and me and Will will link to all the important stuff we talk about in the show notes page. So, Will, how are you doing today?
Hey, I'm good, man. How are you?
Well, Will, most frequent guest of the show, and I'm guessing that I'm bringing you back to talk about one of the most frequent topics on the show. Russiagate's probably one of the top ones, and then alleged chemical weapons attack in Syria would definitely be either one or two as well. Will, I have to give you credit. I think just about, of all the commentators I've seen on these chemical weapons attacks, you've done, a good amount of legwork in reading all these different reports. You even go through like the appendices and, small little reports that the, OPCW puts out on the, alleged chemical weapons attacks. So I really think you're somebody who, I really couldn't have a better guest for this topic on the show. And, with all the thoughts of another, either false flag or, if you listen to John Bolton and Nikki Haley, a real chemical weapons attack happening in Idlib, I figure it's a good time to go through and talk about the past allegations, because typically, one of the main points they make as far as, their claims of a new chemical weapons attack is, well, Assad's done it in the past. So me and Will are going to look at the three examples that have gotten the most attention and have the most evidence on both sides as far as, if this was a real chemical weapons attack or not. The first one that we're going to talk about occurred in 2013, and this was the attack that almost drew Obama into the war. Well, I mean, the U.S. was drawn into the war before that, but, with military and bombing directly against Assad, and this was the attack in Ghouta. Now, this is different from the 2018 attack that we'll talk about later in Ghouta, and I know that, Douma, and I know that Douma is a part of like that Ghouta region. But anyways, this attack is the one that wraps up the most fatalities according to most reports. I think the numbers range from like 300 to 1,700 with, some reports even suggesting 3,000 people having died, but generally, I think the consensus is somewhere between like 1,000 and 1,700 people that are killed in this attack. There's a lot of speculation that sarin was used in the attack, and basically what people claim is that Assad, did this blanket attack, killing civilians and fighters alike, because he was losing the war in order to regain control. So, Will, I guess the claim is that Assad did it, and what does the evidence show?
Yeah, so as you said, this is in August of 2013. This is almost exactly 1 year after Obama gave his Red Line speech, which is sort of an infamous speech now where he sort of like laid down an ultimatum for Assad, that if Assad used chemical weapons or weapons of mass destruction against Syrians, that Obama would intervene more heavily in the war. And as you said, we already were sort of involved there covertly, but he said we would, overtly intervene. And so just after this attack, American officials came out and just like, they were certain that that Assad had done this. John Kerry, who was the Secretary of State at the time, gave a speech right after this incident and said, we know Assad did it like 35 times in a row. But they really didn't know, though. And a lot of stuff has kind of surfaced that throws the claims that Assad was behind it into question. And so not the least of which is MIT ballistics expert Theodore Postel, who we'll be talking about more a little later for these other incidents too. He's been a pretty important analyst in these allegations. But he wrote an assessment in 2014 that really challenged a lot of the claims that Assad carried out the attack. And Postel gets into like the range of the munitions that were allegedly used and like a lot of the technical details, and just found that it was not likely that Assad could have even accomplished this. just given like where his forces were positioned and again the range of the munitions. And so he gets into a lot. Like, you'd really have to go look into that report to get all the details. He gets into very technical minutia there.
Right, but very important. I do remember this one point that the alleged shell that the Assad government would have fired to release the sarin gas in that area was alleged to be fired from a weapon that was wouldn't have been that close to Ghouta. Where the Assad lines were, that target was further than the maximum range for that weapon to be able to hit. And this is a key point because, weapons can't go further than they could go. I mean, there's like physics and limitations. And I mean, this is like the laws of the universe, right? So, unless Assad, has, these magic vortexes or something that are able to carry his weapons further than they otherwise can go, there's a real hole in this story and very early on in the whole thing.
Right. And I mean, I guess if you're trying to really play devil's advocate, you could say that, Assad, carried out some covert mission, deep into rebel territory and staged this attack. But that's a lot to speculate. And also, if you actually go and look at some of the other analysis, it actually fills in a lot more of the picture and makes it very clear that it very likely was a rebel false flag, this chemical attack. So we have a journalist named Seymour Hersh. And I think this article has probably been mentioned on this show more than any other. And it's the red line and the rat line, which is a very long piece. It's like 10,000 words that covers tons of ground. But Seymour Hersh basically lays out how, this Ghouta chemical attack was very likely a rebel false flag. There's indication that the rebels had limited access to actual sarin and that the Turks may have helped them obtain that and that they had a real chemical weapons capability, rebels in Syria. And so I think Hersh's reporting is key in this incident to, understand what probably took place here. The combination of Postel and Hersh's reporting is crucial.
Right. And I think it's very interesting that in this case we have something that is kind of the traditional example of a false flag attack where you committed an attack against yourself in order to garner additional support or morale or whatever. So, people who claim that 9/11 was a false flag say that George Bush either covertly flew those planes into those buildings or something like that in order to provoke the United States into the Iraq and Afghan wars. And so that's what you would look for, and that seems to be what the rebels were shooting for. And as you point out, a critical piece of evidence here is that Obama said that the one thing Assad cannot do, Obama's red line was, if Assad uses chemical weapons, we're going to get involved into that war. Now, Obama didn't say if Assad continues to use barrel bombs, we're going to get involved in the war. If Assad continues to bomb civilian targets, we're going to, get involved in the war. And so if Assad's goal was, either to just indiscriminately kill people or, be willing to, just carpet bomb areas in order to win the war, he could have done that in a lot of ways without using the chemical weapons. And I guess, Will, this is, probably a good time to just mention what one of the outcomes is here. And, I think Ray McGovern says it best, where Putin got involved here and pulled Obama's chestnuts out of the fire because Obama had drawn a red line for the Syrian civil war and said, we will get involved if Assad uses chemical weapons. And that everybody within the U.S. government and the U.S. media believes the claim that Assad uses chemical weapons. And all the hawks were saying, where's our war now? And so Obama, I legitimately think, didn't want to go to war in Syria. And hell, maybe even Obama figured, well, if I draw the red line for just chemical weapons, there's no way that Assad's actually going to do that. So I'll be able to appease the kind of right to protect humanitarian interventionists by drawing the red line, but at the same time avoid any possibility of going to war in the future. Well, then maybe the false flag throws a little bit of, sand in that and creates a problem for Obama. And so explain what happens, the deal brokered by Vladimir Putin, and what impacts this has on further chemical weapons allegations.
Sure. So yeah, as a result, as one of the results of this Ghouta incident, Putin steps in and helps to broker a deal where Assad is going to give up all of his chemical weapon stockpiles, under a U.S. supervised, procedure. And indeed, this happened. And in 2014, the State Department reported and rubber stamped that this thing was good and it was all good to go. And so I would ask, why would they even say that if, later they plan to, I don't know, it's odd that they keep insisting he has more of these weapons when their own agency, the State Department, confirmed that he gave them all up. And another thing to note here, too, is that the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, as I've shown in some of my own reporting, that they continue to report that the Syrian government is more or less cooperating in demolishing the remaining chemical weapons-related facilities. So they got rid of all of their stockpiles of actual weapons, of the actual like gases and chemicals itself, but they still have some of the buildings standing, and there's procedures in place to demolish those. And yeah, according to the OPCW, the Syrian government is cooperating with all this.
Right, and I was just going to mention that, some people will say, well, the buildings are still there, so then the chemical weapons could still be made, blah, blah. We know, like, from situations like the Iraq War, sometimes, these chemicals are very dangerous to move, and with Syria being such an active war zone for all these years, and I think, like, some of the facilities, especially in and around Damascus, were located pretty close to Syrian rebel position. So it may, like, logistically just been impossible for all this time to, destroy and get rid of some of these facilities until the rest of the war was cleaned up.
Right, exactly. And we also know that the U.S. government lies about the nature of some of these facilities, too, and claims that they're more significant than they really are in the Syrian chemical weapons program. But a few other things to note here, just like something that's very odd is that this Ghouta thing happened, this chemical attack, the alleged sarin attack, happened when UN inspectors were in the country, were in Syria. And so, like, if we're asking, like, does it make sense for Assad to do this? Like, that is insane for him to use chemical weapons while UN inspectors are in the country, knowing that Obama had issued this red line ultimatum about the use of chemical weapons specifically. But on the other hand, it actually makes a lot of sense why rebels would do that. That'd be a perfect time for rebels to sort of, to do an attack like that, to stage a false flag. And I guess a final thing I should say here, too, is that Obama effectively admitted that they did not have good intelligence on this, and they did not have proof, despite what John Kerry has said, despite what all the other officials said about their certainty that Assad did this. Obama told Jeffrey Goldberg at The Atlantic in an interview that James Clapper, his DNI, actually told him that the intelligence here was not a slam dunk, which is a reference to what George Tenet, the CIA director under Bush, told Bush about Iraq intelligence. And so he said it was not a slam dunk, meaning like this is not solid. We can't prove this. And so ultimately Obama, they did this, they brokered this deal to get rid of the chemical weapons, and then he didn't bomb or anything. He didn't like go forth with the, so many people urged that he do something and take action, and he actually resisted that in this case.
All right. Well, I think that about covers it for the, 2013 Ghouta attack. And now we're going to move on to Khan Sheikhoun. This is April 2017. So right at the beginning of the Trump administration. This is right when I'm starting my podcast and doing my daily news roundup. So I remember I'm covering here that at the very beginning of the Trump administration, maybe minus Nikki Haley, the Trump administration is really, kind of starting to say, well, we're moving away from the Assad must go policy. It looks like Assad has, is going to retain power in Syria. I mean, Russia stepped in by this point. They won Palmyra back. They've won Aleppo back, and they're really starting to move and take more territory. And then in early April, pretty much right after you had the Trump administration softening on the Assad must go stance, we had this early morning alleged chemical weapons attack, and like I said, in a village known as Khan Sheikhoun. Reports surface later that give more details on the I'll go into the alleged story, and that is that the Assad administration dropped a bomb with sarin in it on this population. I think they claim that around 100 people died, maybe 150 died. Well, I'll let you get into that. And, this was in order to attack, I guess, some Al-Qaeda leaders that were believed to be in the area. So, Will, what do you think is the real narrative on this attack?
Yeah, just to start with the casualty count, I think you're right. I think it was the estimates I saw were between like 75 and 150. It's always kind of sketchy exactly how many people died in these things, in these far-flung conflicts. But yeah, that was the number we had. And of course, just like the last incident in 2013, right after this, American officials start marching out and saying they're certain that Assad did this immediately, despite any, no investigation and no evidence. So there's actually a lot of an independent analysis and journalism on this incident that I think kind of really fill in, like, give us an alternative view of what happened. And I actually compiled a reading list that we can put in your show notes that have like a ton of articles and analyses and assessments and stuff that that your audience can pour through. So just to start with, one of my favorite sources, one of my favorite reporters, Seymour Hersh, his military and intelligence people denied that Assad or Russia were responsible for a chemical attack. They said that it was more likely a conventional weapons attack, and that the Russians and the Syrians had actually even informed their American counterparts over the deconfliction lines and told them that, like, we plan to bomb this rebel command center in Idlib in Khan Sheikhoun, and that's what happened. And a former CIA station chief named Phil Giraldi on a mutual friend of ours show, Scott Horton, he told Scott that his own sources basically corroborated this, that it was a conventional strike, not a gas munition. And so if you kind of trust Hersh or Giraldi and their sources, like, already we have some pretty good reasons to be skeptical of the administration claim.
Why don't we dig just a little bit deeper here, Will, because I know you're somewhat good on this. And, they say, hey, we found that some of these victims looked like they were victims of some kind of chemicals, and then they found markers at the site suggesting that some kind of chemicals were used. So, what is the explanation in your narrative of that evidence?
Well, yeah, there's a lot of reasons why you could end up with an outcome like that. There's reasons why you could end up with false positives of sarin, of not only for, like, evidence being contaminated, but people also exhibiting symptoms of sarin. And so as far as we know, this rebel command center that the Syrians and Russians bombed that morning contained a lot of, like, chemicals and pesticides and organophosphate, like, fertilizers and stuff. It was really like it served partially as a storage facility. And organophosphate fertilizers, when subject to a lot of heat and a lot of, like, crazy conditions, can release pretty much deadly gases, like phosphine gas. And this is something that a great journalist named Gareth Porter has covered in detail, the phosphine gas angle. And actually, specifically, phosphine gas actually messes with an enzyme in the human body called acetylcholine esterase. And phosphine and sarin both do that to the human body. So effectively, having people exhibiting symptoms of gas, of some kind of chemical agent doesn't necessarily mean it was sarin. So that's, like, potentially the explanation behind that. However, there's a lot of other weird stuff too with the victims. Like, if you read the OPCW reports, there's reports of victims showing up to hospitals, like, well before the attack was alleged to even happen. So it's really hazy exactly, like, what victims, like, the nature of the victims, what symptoms they were actually experiencing, and all that. That's all kind of sketchy in my mind.
Right, and we can mention Timothy Postel's role in this investigation as well. There are some pictures of a device that the rebels alleged that it was exploded to release the sarin gas, and Postel, being a weapons expert, was able to look at those photographs and say that this wasn't a bomb dropped from the sky. It was a bomb placed on the ground. Another issue with this chemical weapons attack here and the 2013 Ghouta chemical weapons attack, Will, was that, and maybe you could go a little bit more into this, that the OPCW, the group, the International Watchdog Group that would be tasked with actually inspecting and investigating these chemical weapons alleged usages, were not actually able to go to the site and investigate what happened.
Right, exactly. So the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, typically their, like, standard operating procedure is to send people to places, to the location to investigate. However, in this case, there were sort of security concerns that didn't allow them to actually send personnel into Khan Sheikhoun to investigate this. And there's a journalist named Rick Sterling who covered a lot of, like, the flaws in the OPCW's investigation. In fact, he shows that it was nearly fraudulent. Like, it was so bad, this report. So nobody went to the site, and there was no verified chain of custody for the physical evidence. Meaning that at one point, like, any of this physical evidence could have passed through, like, rebel hands. Like, we don't know. So who knows who could have tampered with this? This is, like, the least rigorous way to investigate an allegation like this, especially one with a extremely sensitive geopolitical aspect. Like, determining who did this is way more sensitive than just, like, a regular crime. And I also alluded to this earlier, but another very odd part of this OPCW report is where it mentions the 57 alleged chemical weapons victims who show up to hospitals, allegedly complaining of chemical weapons related symptoms, but before the attack was said to have taken place. And the report refers to this as irregularities, but just flat out says, like, we didn't follow up to try to determine, like, what this was. And they even say it could have been a staging scenario, which they don't really define what that term means, but I think they kind of mean, like, a false flag, like staging an event to make it look like something it's not. And so Rick Sterling kind of gets into these details in a great piece at Consortium News that maybe we can link to as well.
And, Will, I think one of the important parts of the Khan Sheikhoun attack isn't just the attack, but then the response from the United States. So do you want to mention that at all?
Yeah, exactly. So I forget exactly when, a couple days after the Khan Sheikhoun incident, though, I think it was maybe the 7th, like the gas attack was said to have happened on the 4th. I think it was the 7th that Trump launched a retaliatory missile strike. And he bombed what was called the Shayrat airfield. And the outcome of this attack really didn't do anything. It had no real military importance. I think Seymour Hersh reported that it only destroyed aircraft that were already sort of damaged and out of commission. So it had no real consequence. Except that I think the Syrian state media reports that it did kill civilians in a nearby village, like some missiles went astray or something. And so who knows if that's the case, but that was the response.
Right. If anything, after the attack, it was almost portrayed as a failure because there were reports that I believe 59 Tomahawk missiles were used in total, but only about 9 ended up hitting the actual target. Like you said, 9 people end up dying in a village around the airfield. And it didn't do anything to really slow or limit the Assad capabilities. Now, I mean, one of the important factors could be here is that the Trump administration really didn't want to do anything to limit Assad's capabilities because he was fighting against Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So maybe that played a role in it, but it certainly seemed like, as far as the Feds go, the United States attack, if it was really meant to disrupt the Assad regime, didn't do so.
Right, exactly. And I think there was even reports that they were flying sorties out of the same airfield like the very next day. So yeah, didn't do much. And as you said, that may have been intentional. Maybe Trump didn't really want to do too much. All
right. So the last chemical weapons attack we're going to talk about today is the most recent, I guess about 5 months ago now. And that was in April of 2018, almost a month after the Sheikhoun attack. There's a situation in Douma. And this is like a little town or portion, a neighborhood of eastern Ghouta, that region of Damascus, where there's kind of a final rebel contingency holding out there. These guys are pretty hardened Islamist types. I don't know if they're quite the suiciding Al-Qaeda or ISIS types, but these are definitely people that nobody in the United States would want to live under. And the Assad and Russian had been working to, kind of get these groups to surrender. But there had been a heavy bombing campaign in the whole eastern Ghouta region, and specifically Douma, as these rebels refused to surrender. And so this meant that a lot of people at the time were living in the basement. And apparently it was a particularly dusty day, and the Assad regime was carrying out a lot of airstrikes. And then I guess, again, I'll give the official narrative. What happens is that Assad decides to use chlorine gas this time. I think this is one difference, is they allegedly used chlorine and not sarin in this attack. And about 40 people end up suffocating to death in their basements from this chlorine gas attack. They show pictures of young children that are killed by the chlorine gas. Apparently, President Trump, I believe in both of these more recent gas attacks, was moved by the victims, images of the victims that Ivanka showed him. And in the days after this, we even have CNN reporters sniffing backpacks and saying, well, we smell chlorine gas on them. So, Will, what is, I guess, kind of the alternative narrative, and, what's your evidence for what actually happened in Douma?
Yeah, sure. So I think we should just start mentioning the imagery. Like, as you said, Trump has often been sort of moved by the imagery of victims or whatever, and moved to do something about it. And so in this case, again, we had some photographs that appeared to be of people in houses, and we also had some imagery of a video from like a clinic that showed some people hyperventilating. And this was really bandied about as being real evidence of Assad's guilt or something, or at least of the more honest people would say at least evidence of some kind of chemical weapon. Now, there's a journalist named Robert Fisk who reports for The Independent, who went to Douma actually in the wake of this attack himself, and he spoke to a doctor who worked at that very clinic, the one that video was taken of the people hyperventilating. And he talked to that doctor, and the doctor said, yes, the video was legitimate. However, the people in that video were suffering from hypoxia due to oxygen deprivation from there's a lot of dust flying around. And so he said, like, a lot of civilians had been hiding from the bombing in, either the massive network of underground tunnels that Jaish al-Islam had built under Douma, or just hiding in their basements and stuff. And so when you have tons of people hiding in these close, these cramped quarters and all this dust and all this bombing going on, people do actually succumb to hypoxia and have, suffocate. And so at least this is the account the doctor gave to Fisk. Now, this doctor also claims that very same night, that when there was sort of chaos, people were rushing into the clinic during all the bombing, that at one point a white helmet guy, who I think we've talked about on the show, the Syria Civil Defense, a white helmet guy pops his head in and starts yelling about a gas attack. And he said at that point, it just like erupted into total chaos and everyone started freaking out. But he said there was no real indication of any kind of gas attack. At least this is what he told Fisk. And so this doctor could certainly be some kind of regime apologist. He could just be like, carrying water for Assad. But even this little bit of like unclear evidence, this bit of testimony from this doctor, it's a lot more than what the U.S. gave us before they retaliated to this incident. And so, even just this unclear testimony is a lot more evidence than we got from the governments claiming to know that this happened.
Right. And another key piece of evidence here is they're claiming that chlorine gas, was used, which isn't a chemical, it's not like sarin where it's gonna, it could kill quite a few people depending on how much you use, but it's not something that's gonna kill as widely and as swiftly as a gas like sarin. So there's a question as to why Assad would use a somewhat ineffective chemical weapon when he knows that he could, in the weeks leading up to this chemical weapons attack, Assad and Russia were killing thousands of civilians in this eastern Ghouta region with conventional weapons. And while everybody was saying, we really don't like this and Assad's a terrible guy, nobody was carrying out airstrikes against Assad. But as soon as he carries out these chemical weapons attack, we then get an even bigger military response, this time from the U.S., the U.K., and France. But, it seems very interesting, again, that he would use this chlorine weapon here rather than sarin, if his goal was just to, kill a bunch of people or try to root out the rebels.
Yeah, see, now I had heard, maybe this changed as the reporting sort of rolled out, but I thought officials had claimed at first that Assad had used a combination of sarin and chlorine. I thought at one point they were claiming this, that sarin was at least involved. But
I couldn't tell if that was the actual narrative or when they were using the word chemical weapons, the U.S. media was kind of just extrapolating sarin and chlorine just because they're idiots and don't understand things.
Right. But as you said, though, it's totally right. Chlorine is far less deadly. Sarin is an organophosphate nerve agent. It's designed to kill people. Chlorine is just a very harsh chemical that has a lot of, other uses other than murdering people. But, in terms of the chemicals themselves that were used, the OPCW actually did go to Douma, and in their report, they said they found no organophosphates. So that means no nerve agents like sarin. They said they found some chlorine-related stuff, but not chlorine. It wasn't even clear exactly what they were saying. The OPCW is horrible sometimes, and they're very opaque about their reporting. And then they won't answer questions when you try to follow up. But
right.
Either way, even if they
I
did
think one of the things I do remember, I was going to say, just one of the things I do remember that they were kind of saying was that they found traces of chlorine, but this, chlorine could be used for any number of kind of things in a war zone: sanitation, cleaning water to make it safe to drink, trying to just disinfect, different areas, or especially around hospitals where I think they did some of this testing. Do you want to mention anything about, this is actually the first case where the OPCW is actually able to get to the site and investigate the, alleged attack? Yeah,
and I forget every detail of this specific part of the story. However, I know the OPCW, there was a point where they were trying to get into Douma. There was a very short delay because of some kind of security thing or someone didn't have the right paperwork. However, eventually they were allowed into the site, and they were offered protection, but they weren't totally minded. And so I think they were allowed to do a sort of pretty thorough investigation of these things.
I think at one point it was the UN that was holding it up, and then the first time they tried to go in, remember some lone gunmen opened fire on started shooting around the same time they were supposed to go in. That got delayed another couple days. Right. And I mean, who knows? And people will say, well, that means that Assad planted that gunman there so he had learned to cover up the evidence. And that's certainly not impossible, but nobody has talked to the gunman or figured out exactly what happened there. So you can't really make that claim.
Right. But yeah, either way, so the OPCW ultimately did say they found something related to chlorine, not even chlorine munitions, not even weapons, just something related to chlorine. But either way, it's also not clear where they found this. Did they find this in a rebel area or what? I don't know. Again, the OPCW is not always clear what they mean. But yeah, we have no proof at all of any significant use of chemical weapons here according to the OPCW.
Well, unless do you want to add anything, Will, about the response to this chemical weapons attack, the military response?
Yeah, I'll just get it. I'll just quickly cover this. So before any investigation could be covered at all, within a day or two, the U.S., France, and the UK decided to respond with their own, with bombing or with missile strikes is what I'm trying to say. Excuse me. However, in my own reporting, there was a lot of claims made about the targets in these strikes, about the nature of the facilities, and I showed that at least one of the facilities, one called Barza, right outside of Damascus. They claim that this was a super important facility to the chemical weapons program, and it was at the heart of the whole thing. But the OPCW had been there twice in 2017 and showed that there was nothing amiss there. They didn't find anything wrong. And so just to cover that part, I think the administration was not totally clear or honest about the nature of these targets.
Right, and a couple important things here is just that the administration really rushed it when Assad had cleared the area. There were negotiations going on between Assad, Russia, and the OPCW to get inspectors in there. And I mean, hell, even Robert Fisk, a Western journalist, was able to, visit the area relatively quickly after it happened. So there was time and space for investigation. But they didn't allow it because, I think they knew that the longer the debate went on, the more, kind of fogginess there would be to their story, and the more the evidence would start to line up against it. But Will, we covered these three events, and I think they're pretty important because they're all just a little bit different. Where the first one, I think you have what's more like along the lines of what we think of as a true false flag event, where, the rebels use sarin. The second one, it seems like they probably exploited an event where they saw people dying of gas, to claim that sarin was used. And the third one, I think it was more of a create a panic type situation where you have people choking and people just run out and start yelling gas, gas, gas. And then, the narrative kind of, the story kind of just takes off from there. Is that all you need is somebody with a cell phone, recording video, a white helmet somewhere recording video, and another one yelling or, running around people who are choking and yelling gas. And that will be enough to get the, CNN and the rest of the Western media to start to run stories claiming that Assad used chemical weapons.
Right. And something I think that's very telling about this is there are some differences between the three cases, but the similarities are very illustrative. It's almost always at a time that's extremely, pointless for Assad to use chemical weapons. It makes no sense. However, extremely opportune for the rebels. And so that's a pretty clear pattern in all three of these cases, that the rebels were in a desperate place and Assad was in a place of confidence and strength. And so, yeah, I just think there's there's a clear pattern in these incidents.
I also think the media reporting likewise is pretty similar, where, like I said, they get these reports in the white helmets, which, as we've discussed, and as is an openly known fact, that they're funded by the British, I believe MI6. And, the U.S. and these Western governments, and they have allegiances and ties to Al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, and, the leader of Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra in Syria, al-Jilani, who is, an international terrorist. I'll go into this really quick, a little tangent. There is a state senator, of Virginia, Richard Black, who's actually traveled to Syria twice now and met with Assad and Syrian military leadership. But in his most recent trip, he's pointing out that al-Jilani is now hiding out somewhere where the Syrian army is about to advance. And there's a $10 million price tag on his head by the U.S. government. So it'll be really interesting to see if the Syrian military captures or kills him, if Assad's going to get $10 million from the U.S. government.
That's hilarious, man. I didn't know about that. I mean, I knew about the bounty on his head, but I hadn't thought about that.
Yeah, but that really brings us to what we're, why I wanted to do this show today. And that is, you have this upcoming offensive by the Syrian Arab army, Assad's army, aligned with, his Russian counterparts to help conduct the air operations. And Russia's already carrying out a lot of airstrikes there. From what I've read, the Iranians have agreed to, kind of be in advise and assist roles. Now, I'm guessing that's somewhat like U.S. advise and assist roles where, they're on the front line still and they're still doing some fighting. But, I think that's the way this is, alleged to have broken down. And they're fighting now in the Idlib province. And this is the main, last remaining holdout of the Syrian rebels. Yeah, there's some other Syrian rebel pockets around, Syria. And yes, the Kurds still hold territory to the east of the Euphrates. But as far as the Sunni resistance to Assad, this is the last big holdout. There's tens of thousands of fighters there. I think there's probably about 2 to 2.5 million people living in that territory. And we have now heard from John Bolton, from Nikki Haley, and from the top French military official that if Assad uses chemical weapons, we're going to attack Assad. And similarities to other attacks as well. You have, right before the attack, the United States and these Western government officials saying that if Assad uses chemical weapons, we're going to attack Assad. It's almost like a dog whistle to the Syrian rebels to say, guys, we're waiting for a false flag. We have our eyes open. Go ahead and carry out a false flag. So I don't know, Will, if you want to talk a little bit about that and, if you see any potential for another false flag type attack here.
Yeah, as you said, Idlib is that is where Assad and Russia have been sort of consolidating the remainder of the rebels. Like every time there's a reconciliation deal, like in Hama or even in Douma, like after that whole chemical weapons controversy, there's a reconciliation deal and the rebels are either allowed to stay under certain conditions or they're allowed to flee to Idlib. And many of them have been doing that. And sort of the idea is to consolidate them there for one final offensive. But as you said, it's funny. It's very odd how every single time it seems like the U.S. comes out and like messages or signals that like, hey, we wouldn't appreciate a chemical weapons attack right now. We would really not like that. And, wink, wink. It's what it seems like, at least, if we're being kind of cynical about it. But the reaction, at least, to the preparation for this Idlib offensive, it's already kind of begun. There's some like softening up airstrikes being done in preparation for the actual offensive, but the sort of official reaction to this has been sort of hysterical. Like, how do U.S. officials not understand that this has been the plan all along, to consolidate the remainder of the rebels in Idlib and then to do it, or to do this offensive and clear them out? The fact that they're freaking out about it and acting like it's this big, crime or something itself is a crime, I don't know. It just seems very fishy to me. And the chemical weapons suggestions or allegations are kind of making me even more suspicious.
Right. And, and me and Will aren't saying that we think it's a good idea for Assad to roll through with heavy air support from the Russians and, take all this territory back. It may be in some cases a good thing because there's jihadists running the village and they're going to make the people more miserable than, 100 Assad bombs and then living under Assad control, which is at least a little bit more liberal and better than Al-Qaeda control. But in other cases, maybe there's like free Syrian rebel types that control certain towns and villages, and the people would rather live under them than Assad. And Assad is going to forcefully take back that territory and kill some people, innocent people along the way. And that's absolutely terrible. But it does seem that at least if we, kind of look at what's happening in the rest of the Syrian civil war and even the general war against ISIS, that whether you're, the Iraqi government, the U.S. government, any of the U.S. coalition partners, Russia, Syria, Iran, you take back this territory from the Al-Qaeda jihadist types with pretty brutal force. And it requires a lot of bombing. And, they put snipers on the 4th story of an apartment building that is full of the rest civilians. And it creates these terrible situations where hundreds of civilians end up dying at a time. And, I brought up State Senator Richard Blatt before. A couple times in that video, he pats the Syrian military official behind him on the back and says, these are the good guys. And I certainly don't think I would ever say that about a Syrian military official. But, I think his larger point is that the opposition here is Al-Qaeda and al-Nusra and Jelani, who's, blood oath loyal to Osama bin Laden, the enemy of the American people. And so, this is a very difficult situation. And, like I said before, conventional weapons seem fine to use, but I'm guessing that, at some point in here, we will at least get some claims that Assad is using chemical weapons. Because there's pretty frequent claims, but me and Will just discussed the 3 times where there was enough proof or momentum behind those claims to provoke a Western reaction. But, there may even be another one of these situations where there, again, enough momentum or enough evidence to provoke another Western reaction.
Yeah, and I think it's important, too, to cover the prior incidents in order to recognize potentially, another fraudulent incident or something where they're not totally telling us the truth. It's harder to recognize it if you're not sort of moored to history, if you don't understand prior cases. And so I think, sort of harping and really hitting on these and sort of teaching by repetition, I think is important on these cases because it teaches people to recognize these things when they happen in real time.
Right. And one of the main premises that anyone who alleges that Assad uses chemical weapons in the future, one of their main arguments is going to be is, well, he used him in the past. And hopefully you could use today's show to, kind of disprove the main claims that people are going to bring up that Assad used chemical weapons. Well, Will, do you have anything else you want to mention on the Syrian civil war, Assad, chemical weapons in general?
I would just urge skepticism. There's all these claims about chemical weapons. If something happens, don't jump headlong into supporting some intervention to retaliate. Look into it.
Yeah, the only thing I want to add is just there's kind of one fundamental difference this time than the previous times, and that is since the last chemical weapons attack, April, in Douma, the OPCW did an end run around the UN Security Council and actually voted themselves the power to assign blame in these chemical weapons attacks. That means that in the past they were just kind of able to, cobble together a report and say, like, these are all the findings. We did these soil samples. We got this. We talked to these witnesses. We talked to these hospitals. And this is all the information we got. This time they could actually say, no, we know Assad did it. And, that could be a real problem because I'm guessing that, that part of the story is going to be left out a lot. And the kind of the point from the mainstream media and the U.S. government will be, hey, look, even the OPCW this time is able to say Assad did it.
Yeah, that's extremely alarming because the OPCW is not totally impartial. And in fact, if you look at who funds them and stuff, the states that fund them, it's not impartial. It's not it's not a neutral body by any means.
All right, well, thank you for coming on the show again. It's always a pleasure to have you on. You bring a lot of information, and I think this is one of the topics that I consider you the best on. So, thanks for coming on the show. Tell my audience where they can find your work, even though I'm sure they all know who you are and where to find your work.
Yeah, and I appreciate you having me on and your kind words about this stuff. I think this, especially the chemical weapons stuff, I think it's super important to cover this. Humanitarian intervention and using humanitarian guises to justify war. I think that's exactly what we need to be, more work needs to be done on that. But, if you want to find my work, you can find me at antiwar.com sometimes, libertarianinstitute.org, consortiumnews.com. On Twitter, you can find me at WKP-ANCAP, ANCAP. And if you really like what I do and want to support it, you can find me at patreon.com/WKPjournalist. All
right. And this show, the show notes page, can be found at libertarianinstitute.org, just like Will's work and just like my daily news roundup. My website is immersionnews.com. If you want to help the show, really to grow and, for me to have more incentive to do it, patreon.com/foreign policy focus, Twitter at KYAAALE, and Facebook is Libertarian Union. Thanks, Will.
Thanks, Cal.